Let's begin with a root, which is known as the foundation of a term. Next, let's move on to the combining form, which is a combination of the root and the combining vowel, which can be classified as /o. Let's begin with some combining form examples. To begin with, the first example will be cardio, in which this is defined as heart. Another example of a combining form is adipo. Adipo, which is defined as fat. My last example would be tracheo, which means trachea. Let's then move on to suffixes, which means the end of a word in all medical terms. Let's begin with some examples. Do not forget to add the dash in front of the suffix, which shows that it is not a prefix nor a root. Let's begin with the first example, which would be itis, which is defined as the inflammation. Let's move on to our second example, which would be emesis. Emesis is the definition of vomiting. Another example of a suffix is scopy, which means visual examination. Just a reminder, always remember that the dash always goes before the suffix. Let's then move on to prefix, which means a small part attached to the beginning of a term, but not all medical terms have a prefix. One example of prefix would be epi, which means above. Also, do not forget that when you have a prefix, the dash goes after the prefix and not before. Another example of a prefix is pro, which means before or forward. The last example of a prefix is hypo, which means deficient, below, under, less than normal. Let's review that prefix is always at the beginning of the medical term, but not all medical terms have a prefix. Remember that the root is always in the middle and the suffix is at the end with the dash in the front of the suffix. Also, do not forget that you will drop the combining vowel when the suffix begins with a vowel. Let's begin with an example of when you will drop the combining vowel when suffix begins with a vowel. For an example would be epidermic. It's not epidermic. You would drop the O and leave it as IC. So when reading this word, you would read the word backwards, which would be IC means pertaining to epiderm, which means above or on the skin. Another example would be hepatitis, which means titus would mean inflammation and hepa means liver. Another example would be Another example of a combining form when dropping a vowel would be diarrhea, which you would drop the O and leave it the way it is already. The meaning of this word, which means frequent passage of loose, watery stools. Now let's look at the root. The roots may seem very similar. For example, myelin, which means spinal cord, and my means muscle. See how these can be very similar, but definition is very much opposite? Please do not mix these up. Another example would be graph and graphy. As you can see, that graph actually means instruments for recording, while graphy can actually mean process of recording. You see why spelling actually matters and why the definitions are very different, even though the words may seem very much alike. Let's begin to break down the terms. For example, cardiologist. Since the suffix starts with a vowel and has two roots, when breaking it down, we must drop the O, which means the ist, the log, and cardio, which you would drop the vowel which would be cardiologist, would then mean specialist in cardio, and log means the study of hearts. Another example would be tonsillitis, which is broken down to tonsils, which then the O is dropped and becomes tonsillitis, which means the inflammation of tonsils. Another example would be biology, which is broken down by biology, which means the study of life. These two terms very much look alike, but they have different meanings. Scopy means visual examination. So for example, if you were to get an endoscopy, then it is the process of the visual examination, while scopy is a tool used to examine the organs. Very much different definitions, and the practice of them are very different. Another pair that is very similar but have different meanings are stomy, tomy, and esotomy. Which stomy would be a new opening rather than the removal. And tomy is the process of cutting. As you can see, they're very different and have different spellings, especially the beginning of the suffix. Making sure that you spelling is very important in situations like this. Another pair that are very similar is graph, graphy, and gram. Graph is actually the instrument for recording, whereas graphy is the process of recording, while gram means record. These terms are very important and look very similar but have different meanings.